Hello everyone, and welcome back, finally! After taking some time off to get used to the new lifestyle that is having a newborn in the house, I've decided to get back to painting in style with Battletech, one of my favorite franchises. In honor of reading Michael Stackpole's Clan Invasion novels to my son to pass the time, and also in preparation for Wave 2 of the Clan Invasion Kickstarter fulfilling very soon, I decided to paint up some Clan Wolf Battlemechs. Now in the novels, Clan Wolf paint all their Battlemechs gray, but that is super boring, so I went with the possibly apocryphal paint scheme from Unit Color Compendium and Camo Specs for the Golden Keshik. Since that is Phelan Kell's command unit, I've also decided to theme them all after Phelan Kell's Battlemech Grinner to a certain extent. This is a pretty simple paint scheme, but still way more striking than flat gray, so I hope it helps some of you out there paint up your clan Battlemechs in a little bit more stylish way. The twist of today's video is that we'll be making metal Battlemechs. All the painting is going to be the same on metal or on plastic, but the metal ones have a lot more steps for constructing them, so if you do want to get into some of the older school, nice, hefty metal models, although some of them have very weird sculpts, some of them look really good, so you'll probably want to try it out at some point. And there's a couple of tips that I'd like to pass on to you in order to make that as smooth as possible. First of all, as you can see here, the bases come hollow, which means that models with free legs, like this Battlemech here, will not fit well on those bases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to 3D print some fillers for those bases. This is a very simple hexagon shape, and if you have a 3D printer, it should be quick to make. I'm just going to grab the measurements here for it, and then I'm going to be taking that electronically later on to make a hexagon shape that I can print out and fill the spaces in for those Battlemechs that have loose legs. Other ones, like the Wolfhound, do have hexagon shapes on their feet already that fit perfectly into the bases, and that's just too simple, but they can't all be like that, I guess. For metal miniatures, there are some concerns about how well the metal sticks to each other. The metal bits don't hold together necessarily perfectly with super glue and will fall apart very easily. You can use some sort of epoxy to hold them together, and I would recommend that if you're really worried about it. It is going to be much stronger, but it's a fussy material to work with and you might not have it available. And while I was doing this video, there was a bit of a super glue and epoxy shortage around my area, so I was just going to use the minimum amount of super glue and that's it. So, the trick you're going to want to use to help these things stick is pinning. That's what I'm doing here. Grabbing a drill, if your drill bit is too small for your drill, I guess you could do it with your hands like I do, just the sort of makeshift way, and drill out some pinholes on the limb and the Battlemech that you're trying to stick the limb to. The drill bit has been sized for this particular wire that I'm going to be using, and I'm going to cut off small bits of that wire that are going to fit in the sockets in both the Battlemech and the limb. And what that's going to do is it's going to give the super glue more contact area to grip onto, and it's going to give a lot more rigidity to that limb. The longer and deeper you can do this, the better. My pins are pretty shallow. It's not the best pin job necessarily, but I'm not too worried about these. I don't throw them around that much, and a lot of these limbs on the Battlemechs we have here already have a bit of a socket and plug arrangement cast onto them, so they're relatively solid joints to begin with. Before I get too far ahead of myself, all of these models were painted previously by me. I didn't like their paint jobs, I stripped them. That served as the cleaning process, but if you are using metal miniatures, make sure you clean them, even if they're fresh from the factory, because they could have some demolding agents that'll stop your paint from sticking. With that aside, complete, we also want to make sure we pin the models that have hex bases and the other ones to the bases so that we get a solider connection there as well. This isn't normally as important as pinning the limbs because, especially for the Wolfhound here with this big hex base, there's a lot of surface area in contact. We're going to use a lot of glue there, and I'm going to use even more glue when I'm actually putting detail and texture on the bases. So really, this is just sort of better safe than sorry. You can put some pins in if you want, and it's fairly easy to do because you can drill through the hexagonal base pretty easily. My way to do it is put the pins into the base of the model, then just scrape the lead base along the bottom. This will leave you nice little registration marks showing you where to drill, because the lead is of course softer than most metals that your wires are going to be made of, so they just sort of scrape into it and scratch away, and it's very visible and easy to mark down and drill afterwards. Filling those holes with super glue and then pushing the pins into them, you'll end up with a very solid connection for your Battlemechs, making sure that they're going to stay on their nice hefty bases for quite some time to come. This next bit is just going to be me ranting about a tool for about a minute, so if you're not new to modeling and you don't need to buy yourself a drill or something like that, don't worry about it too much. But I just want to talk about this Citadel hand drill that I got. I bought it early on when I was just getting into tabletop miniatures, and I have not been happy with it for multiple reasons. First of all, it doesn't fit very small bits, which when you're working with miniatures, you want it to fit very small bits. And second of all, as you can see here in this video in the background, as I start screwing it in, driving it to the right in the direction that I'm going to need to in order to drill into things, the way that my hand wants to hold it anyway ends up unscrewing the pommel, if you want to call it that, of the screwdriver from the body, and it just falls apart in your hands. It's so frustrating. So anyway, I can't recommend this drill, and if you think, oh, Games Workshop, they're a modeling store, I can buy modeling bits from them, don't buy the drill, okay? Anyway, with that little warning aside, let's get back to actual business, building these models. So I talked earlier about the hex bases I'm going to need to fill in for the other models with free legs. Those three that have their bases already made. Ooh, too easy. But these guys, they don't balance very well on the edges of the base. The software I'm going to use to fix this is called Tinkercad. It's free and it runs in your browser. Just tinkercad.com. You can log in with a Google account, so what you're probably using to access YouTube right now. Drag yourself some primitive shapes from the right, and then by clicking on the handles on the sides of a shape, you could just enter whatever size you want in millimeters, and it makes you a model just like that. Blender's easy enough as well, but in this case I wanted to show off a different program that runs in a browser and is very easy to access, so hopefully that can help you. Exporting from there to STL and printing out is very similar to what I did in my previous video on making small cities for DBA using 3D printing. With these sockets placed inside of the miniature bases, I get all the benefits of a heavy metal base that'll help stabilize these very, very large metal miniatures, but also a flat surface for the metal miniatures to actually glue down to, or pin down to if you do want to make some more stable footing for them. The Uller, and yes, I'm going to use the inner sphere name for it, is a great example of this because the contact area under its feet, in the way that I've posed it, sort of dynamically, is so small, I really, really want those pins to make sure it's kind of stable. In the case of the Nova and the Daishi, that's not as important because they have fairly wide feet and there's a lot of space for the super glue to catch, but still, you could put pins in to be sure, and I did. The next step here is where we start coming to stuff that's really common across metal or plastic miniatures, and that's textures. That's both on the bases and on the models themselves. Once you've got them firmly affixed on their bases and they're nice and stable, we're going to start filling in the gaps around the models that had built-in bases, as well as just topping everything with a little bit of texture to make it look good. As I mentioned earlier, there was a shortage of super glue, so I'm going to be using white glue to stick down all of my basing materials. Now these are going to be very similar to what I've done in previous videos, but because I'm using white glue, the order is going to change a little bit. And I'm also adding sand to my baking soda in order to just change up the texture and vary it a little bit. I just wanted to make something that looked a little more interesting in this case. White glue also has an additional advantage in this case in that it is thick and gloopy, and we can use it to fill in some of the gaps around the edges of the bases here. There's little cracks even on the ones that I filled in with the hex bases because I gave myself a slightly wide tolerance to make sure it fit. And there's a very wide gap around the base of the models with built-in bases that we need to fill in, and the white glue will help us do that to a certain extent. The rest will hide with flock later on. So I'm using sand and baking soda to get a difference in texture and make things look sort of different levels of roughness across the base, but I need to wait until later to add my cat litter stones, because the cat litter, being clay, if it was added to white glue, would just soak up that water, get really, really soft and mushy, and break off later on under your primer, and just ruin the whole thing. So ask me how I know that. So in order to add these, I'm going to use some of my precious super glue in small drops on the base, and then I'm going to drop the cat litter over top to make small clumps of stone. This looks a little different than spreading the stones naturally across the entire base, but I think looks fine anyway, because later on with the flock, the small individual stones don't show nearly as much anyway, whereas lumps of gravel at their feet, or I guess it's much larger than gravel considering these are 3 stories tall, but the small clumps of stones at their feet stand out a little bit more through the flock than individual stones would anyway. Afterwards, you can add a little more baking soda to just activate that cyanoacrylate glue, set it up faster, and also add a little bit of texture to make sure that it doesn't get too smooth where the glue was. Going back in with a file afterwards to remove all of the white glue and sand is a great idea if you want the edges of your bases to look fairly smooth. Otherwise, you're probably going to have some stuff that trickled over the side, and it's not going to look that great. As usual, I recommend using painting bases in order to hold your models so you can get to all angles of them while you're painting them. I do have a tutorial on how to make these really, really cheap ones here. It's in the card now. When you're working with hefty models like these, you're not going to want to use blue tack. It's not going to be quite strong enough to hold on these big metal miniatures. So I'm using hot glue in this case. I've taken the blue tack off, I'm just putting hot glue on top, and I'm going to hold them in place that way. I did still have the Gladiator, big tall boy that he is, fall over once and fall off of the base, breaking the hot glue bond, but hot glue is so easy to put back on, that was too easy. I fixed it fairly quickly thereafter. So I strongly recommend going with this for your own purposes as well. After the hot glue has been applied and the models are on the painting bases, I'm going to move on to the one technical paint I have actually found use for in almost every project, and that's a Grelin Earth. I love the crackly texture it gives. It's great for all sorts of things, but in this particular project, I'm going to be using it around the feet of the Battlemechs to make it look like they're really crunching down into the soil underneath them, and also for battle damage on the Battlemechs. So I put it all around their feet. It sticks fairly well as long as you make sure that all the loose baking soda has been taken away. And then I'm going to put it on areas on the Battlemech that I want to look like have been scarred by lasers or struck by autocannon rounds. And I use just this little pointy sculpting tool to pick away at the centers and shape these into craters or troughs on the armor. And I think it looks really good. The next step is to prime the models and then apply the base coat. Now my priming I do with an airbrush using Vallejo black primer, followed by a zenithal highlight. That's a highlight from above, just spraying downwards with a white ink to sort of pick out the highlights and shaded areas and help me see the shapes on the model for when I'm painting over them later on. The first actual paints I'm going to use are a cheap white acrylic paint. This is just a craft paint from Michael's, a local art store. And the same, this is a Flow Acrylic black. Flow Acrylic is just a little thinner already, so it's a little easier to mix, and I kind of like using it. Also from Michael's, that art store. I've had questions about my paintbrushes, so this is the first one I'm starting with. This is a number 5 paintbrush. It's fairly thick, and it's going to let me just slather paint on to get the first step done quickly. Painting with a newborn around, I've had to learn how to make the best out of whatever little painting windows I got. So I'm going fairly quick over these models, and it worked out quite well for me in the end. I think just slathering on paint at the beginning and correcting it later is a lot quicker than sort of trying to make sure that you get everything perfect the first time, because you're probably still going to need to make corrections anyway if you're anything like me. My hands are far too shaky to actually go in with a small brush and actually get everything right on the first attempt. So use a big brush and just go in this way. If you don't have a big brush, that's fine. You know, go in with a small brush and just do it carefully, and then you won't have to take time to come back and correct it later. That's cool too. The areas you want to hit with green, in my opinion, are the mechanical areas, like underneath the legs of these Battlemechs, as well as any of the joints and arms and that kind of stuff. I'm next going to go in with 2 more cheap craft paints. This is a red and a brown, also from Michael's. Their Artist's Loft brand is very cheap and very usable. I'm mixing them in about a 1-to-1 ratio to get a red-brown color, as it says on Unit Color Compendium, for the color of the golden Keshik's camouflage, quote-unquote. I guess their paint scheme. I guess it must be more of a parade scheme, but there you go. And I'm going to go in once again with a large brush and just block in the areas I want for that. This, on the other hand, compared to the mechanical areas I'm doing in gray, is going to be a lot of the forward-facing, sort of larger elements that look sort of like plates applied over top of the mechanisms underneath. I want it to be sort of color forward, and I want to make sure that I get a nice division between the 2 colors. So where there are good breaks in the shape, I'm going to emphasize those breaks with breaks in the colors. Battlemechs like this are fairly easy to turn very, very bland and just muddy, either by painting them all in one color and not having a lot of shape in it, because they are complicated sort of shapes up close, but not really at a distance, or by going in and, you know, painting a lot of weathering on later and just muddying up your colors. I find it doesn't look that great at tabletop distance. So I'm trying to make sure that the bulky shapes of the model are emphasized by my choice of 2 bold colors in the actual paint scheme. I hope that makes sense to you. Sort of, you're looking for something, if you're like me and you want to play games with these miniatures, you're looking for something that looks good from 3 feet away and is readily identifiable both as the mech you're looking at and as, you know, a mech in general. And I think if I just painted it all one color, it's a much more challenging job to make that sort of depth and dynamic look pop out when you're looking at it from far away. So, something to consider. Even though these seem like simple models, there's a bit of work that you can put in to make them look a little bit better at a distance and to make them play a little bit better as models for a game, essentially. That is what we're doing here. With the 2 major colors blocked in, hopefully you'll get something you're happy with. I was pretty glad with how these turned out, but I do a couple of little corrections, adding more gray areas to what look like sort of technical panels, and adding more red areas to areas that look like larger plates, and breaking up the shapes a little bit more to make them look more clear. But largely, this is the color scheme I stick with. For the next step, I'm grabbing a smaller brush. This is a number 1. Most of the brushes I use here are Da Vinci Maestro. I haven't tried enough brush brands to endorse these above all others, but I can say they work well for me. And I'm going to use this slightly smaller brush to just go in and correct the edges by going back with the gray to touch up sort of wherever the colors interacted and make sure that the lines are crisp and clean. Again, making sure the shapes are very, very clear. It's important to keep the lines crisp and clean, otherwise everything just kind of looks sloppy afterwards. And now I'm going to do highlights. The number of highlights you do is up to you and how smooth of a gradient you want to achieve on your panels. In my case, I'm just going to do one coat of highlights because this was kind of a project I was trying to get done as fast as possible to sort of fulfill myself and get back into hobbying after having the newborn. So you could go in and just work your way up from sort of the dark color to a lighter color in multiple steps from one end to the other of every panel, and this would look really good and it helps the blend be a little smoother on the panel. But if you, like me, just want to get the model sort of ready at a very good, in my opinion, tabletop standard, then you can just go in like this and paint all of the edges of the panels facing in one direction. I recommend you try to look at the model from one side regularly and imagine that all of the light is coming from your eyes, if that makes sense, sort of like a laser beam onto that side. And think about which edge of every panel would be catching the most light as a result. And just highlight that edge of the panel. Doing this consistently across the model, all from the same direction, helps once again illustrate sort of the edges between panels and pop out smaller shapes on the model. From a distance, this will just make the colors look a little more dynamic. They'll pop more, and if you get the lighting just right, they'll look like they're being lit a little more realistically for vehicles of their size, if that makes sense. The light doesn't catch small objects the same way it catches large objects, so it'll make them look a little better lit from a distance, and from up close, it'll really make these smaller details, all those little panel lines and little elements, weapons and stuff that the sculptor went to so much work to sculpt on, it'll make them pop out as you bring the models up closer to your face as well. So doing at least one coat of highlights is fantastic, and if you can do 2 or 3 of increasing lightness, just close them up towards those panel edges as you do so. Another place to spend some time and energy is on lenses, and this is both cockpits and on weapons. So I'm going to show how I do blue lenses. That'll be for my large lasers and PPCs. I'm basing my colors off of the MechWarrior Online weapon colors. And I do this by mixing basically a gradient on my wet palette. Again, I have a tutorial for that. The link is in the card. By going from black to white with the desired color, blue in this case in the middle, and then when I'm applying it to a model, I work from that black end to the white end. Once again, this is something that benefits the more layers you put in and the more sort of gradations between the black and the white you put in, the smoother this gradient is going to be. But at the very least, you want to make sure you get a black-ish, like a dark blue, then a mid-tone blue, then a light blue, and then a single white dot in the center of a highlight. And that'll make this look glowy and jeweled and bright, and I think that looks great. If you want to add more flavor to the Battlemechs, you can go to, I use this app called Mech Factory on the phone. It shows the record sheets for all the mechs and lets me use it as a reference for what weapons are located where, which helps me when painting it because I want to make the lenses different colors for the different kinds of weapons. Again, I use the MechWarrior Online scheme, so that's blue for large lasers and PPCs, green for medium lasers, and red for small lasers. And I use the exact same gradient of black to white, working my way from the black to the white, gradually more towards the corners as I do so, for all of those different kinds of lenses, whether it be these blue ones, green ones, or red ones. And this kind of detail, this little bit of a pop, really stands out on a dark paint scheme like this. When you're looking at something like the paint scheme that is dark brown red and a dark gray, and then you add something that's light colored and white and pops, it'll really draw the eye to the cockpit and to the weapons, and I think those are very important parts of a battle mech, so I think it's great to draw the eye to them by adding these light highlights on. I wanted to focus in on the Nova's cockpit here because it is a great example of a big canopy, where I'm trying to use 2 opposing highlights to draw the idea that it's reflecting the light from the sky, both in a small pinpoint reflection, opposite sort of in the corner, and a large reflection that catches the edges of the canopy, and I think this looked really good and had a lot of depth on the canopy. I also wanted to add teeth to all the Battlemechs. This is where I'm saying I'm inspired by Phelan Kell's Battlemech Grinner. I'm using the Tamiya Modeling Brush Pro here, my smallest brush, or smallest reliable brush, to just add them in as little points. Now, Phelan Kell's Battlemech has teeth, and that Grinner would be this wolfhound here, but I'm going to add them to all of these Battlemechs just for a little bit of flair and to sort of draw the star +1 together in style so that I can use them all together in a game and it'll look kind of cool. This is pretty simple with a small brush. I've just got white paint and I'm just pressing the brush in sideways to use that point of the brush to add the small points of the teeth along the edge of the cockpit. Now we're getting on to some more interesting sort of techniques. The bases themselves, this is pretty standard. I'm going to go in with brown paint. This is, again, cheap acrylic craft paint from Artist's Loft. I'm using as many cheap materials as possible because, you know, we're all on a budget here and we want to make our things stretch as much as possible. So there are times for expensive paints and there are times for craft paints. And this is one of the times for craft paints. Just throwing out that brown paint there. I'm just painting everything over with brown because I want to add decals, and the decals require me to go in with a gloss varnish first in order to make them stick onto the smooth surface before going in later on with a matte varnish to draw the texture of the whole mech together. And since I want the grass to receive as little varnish as possible to keep it sort of fluffy, I wanted to wait until after the gloss varnish and decals were applied to go on with that. I have another video that goes more into depth on applying decals, so I'm going to kind of blitz through it here. But basically pick a decal of the size that you want for the location you want on your battle mech, then cut it out with a craft knife. Scissors aren't great because they bend the edges of the paper and they can kind of damage your decal. So use a sharp craft knife, just pick out the shape and try to stay as close as you can to the decal without damaging the decal itself. Stick the decal in water to separate it from its backing, then add a little water to the location on the mech you want to apply the decal, then draw the decal out with your brush and nudge it into position. You can use the brush, wicking away any moisture onto yourself or onto a towel, and draw the moisture off of the decal to help it stick, ultimately. If there's texture underneath the decal, dab away at it when you're removing the water, and this will help push it into the cracks and help it stick down so that it matches up with the texture. If you have battle damage, you can cut the decals and make them lay over the battle damage to make it really look dynamic on your battle mech, like the damage actually damaged an insignia. Now, before I go on with the matte varnish, I'm also going to add a pin wash. I don't like using washes broadly on my models because they end up sort of just smudging everything and ruining what was otherwise a lot of effort on a paint job. But in small, precise doses, using in this case a 000 small brush, I'm going to use a very, very thin wash that I mixed myself using black ink, brown ink, water, and airbrush flow improver to sort of reduce the surface tension, and I'm just going to stick to the actual panel lines on the battle mech. I really don't want this to get onto any other surfaces and just spread around because I don't want this to look smeared and greasy. I want the colors to pop and I want the shapes to be very visible at tabletop distance from 3 feet away. So I'm really trying to be precise with this and just put it where I think areas would be shadowed to help, again, pop out those panel lines just a little bit. I'm also going to apply it onto the decals themselves, on the corners and edges, to draw them down to the color of the battle mech itself, and also put some in and around all the battle damage to seem like scorching. Now I'm going to add my flock. The flock for the bases that we've been waiting for a little while now is a mixture that's a bit different from usual. I'm using 2mm flock now instead of 6mm flock to try and get something that's a little more battle mech sized, I guess. And I'm using a darker flock than usual because I thought a darker green would look really good against the red of these mechs. I'm going to apply the glue a little sparingly here because I went to a lot of work to get the rocks and the ground texture right as I wanted it, and I'm going to want that to show later. So applying some Mod Podge, you could use any glue, but Mod Podge is really smooth, so I do recommend it. Then applying the flock, sort of tapping it on, and then running my finger around the edges to remove any flock that's stuck to the edges of the base, so that the edges of the base remain clean for later on. I'm then going to take these over to my airbrushing hood to apply matte varnish. But before I do that, I'm going to use the empty airbrush as the little air gun that it is and blow away any of the spare flock that are on the bases of my miniatures. This is just a sort of simple, quick trick. Make sure you don't blow it onto other models and make sure you check the edges of your base again so you don't stick any where it shouldn't be. But this will just help you clean the bases up and help you get that shape that you want if you did leave some empty areas like I did. For the varnish, I'm going to apply it sparingly, but make sure it's on everywhere, and especially make sure that the decals now are the same surface sort of texture as everything else. Because normally they're going to be plasticky and a little glossy. After applying matte varnish, everything should match up and look perfect together. Going on now to trim the Battlemechs. The paint scheme for the golden Keshik involves a golden trim, so I grabbed my Vallejo bronze and gold paints. I'm using more expensive paints for this because metallics on a small area, you really want it to be a fine paint so that the metal flakes aren't too big and it doesn't look too coarse. I opted for bronze in this case instead of gold because I didn't want it to pop out too much and take away too much of the attention from those weapon lenses and cockpits. And I'm going very, very thin with this because personally I think the gaudy gold trim isn't exactly the best feature of this paint scheme. While I think it's interesting to have them have something that marks them out as part of the golden Keshik, as it were, I didn't want to just, make it gold everywhere and ruin all of the highlighting on the edges of the panels and all this kind of stuff that I'd worked on before. So you do want to wait until after your matte varnish to apply the metallic paints because matte varnish will rob the metallic paints of their sheen, and if they're not shiny, then they're not really metallic, so all you did was put yellow on your mech. For the base edges, I'm going to go back in with my Vallejo black primer. This is just largely something I do only on metal miniatures, and it's basically just because this will help add another layer of protection to the areas that are most likely to chip on the metal miniature. They shouldn't chip, but hey, why not use the primer? I have it, and it applies okay with a thick brush in this case. I'm now going to use another 000 brush, and I'm going to put some markings on the front of my bases. I saw this on Instagram. It seems like a great idea because these models aren't too bad for it, but a lot of those new plastics have, a torso twist on and they're running one way and aiming the other way, and it can be hard sometimes to tell which hex face is their front facing. So with a little bit of this orange and a little bit of the medium flesh tone from Vallejo, I'm using, again, expensive paints because I need it to be a fine job. I'm just going to mark out a little wedge, and this will show me which way they're facing at all times, and keep it really easy to identify when actually playing the game. Whew, that was a heck of a project to fit under 25 minutes, but I barely did it. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I'm really excited to be coming back to YouTube. I hope I can get it a little more regular, but there's probably still going to be some absences while we figure out the whole kid thing. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you're looking forward to the Battletech Clan Invasion Wave 2 as much as I am. Hopefully I can also get a chance to break out these miniatures for some actual games sometime in the near future. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, thank you all so much again for coming along with me on my painting journey, and if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, do throw them down in the comments section. I love to see it. If you do want to follow along with my projects, I try to post about what I'm doing semi-regularly on Instagram, link is down in the description, and I do try to post even more regularly, at least weekly, when I've got something on the go on Patreon. So if you do want to support me on Patreon, definitely give that a look. If you don't, hey, that's cool too. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, go play some games.